When you look at the historical record of the 20th century, you eventually have to confront a difficult question. Are we looking at a genuine recipient of supernatural gifts, or the most successful, naturally explainable religious phenomenon in modern history? Francesco Forgione lived from 1887 to 1968. He began his life as exactly the kind of person history usually forgets, a rural southern Italian who joined the Capuchin order, trading his name for a habit and blending into a long line of identical friars. But he didn't stay anonymous. Under the name Padre Pio, he became one of the most polarizing and heavily documented figures of his era. To understand how this happened, we have to trace his isolation. He was sent away from his hometown to the remote, rocky terrain of the Monte Gargano Peninsula. He was placed in a small, isolated friary in San Giovanni Rotondo, and it was inside this exact location that a 50-year phenomenon took place. But he wasn't operating in a vacuum. A few hours to the northwest sat the Vatican, the institutional counterbalance responsible for evaluating and often suppressing claims of the miraculous. This 50-year record includes 2 Vatican-certified healings and over 1,000 contested claims, ranging from medical anomalies to single-witness devotional folklore. These events triggered a collision between 2 opposing forces. On the ground, you had intense, overwhelming popular devotion. Above him, you had highly hostile, skeptical scrutiny from his own institution. To evaluate his life accurately, we have to pierce through the noise. We must look past hagiography that accepts every legend, as well as the reflexive skepticism that dismisses physical anomalies without analyzing the data. The institutional resistance he faced was severe. The Holy Office, the Vatican's doctrinal watchdog, sanctioned Pio 3 separate times during his life, restricting his public ministry and questioning his credibility. This skepticism reached the highest levels of the Church. Pope John XXIII, reviewing reports of the phenomena in his private diary, referred to the devotion around Pio as a straw idol. Yet that historical Vatican skepticism failed to halt the momentum on the ground. This is the physical footprint of San Giovanni Rotondo today. Millions of people travel here. Their faith is anchored to the specific physical claims that Padre Pio's life was a point of supernatural intercession. This creates a difficult problem for the historian. Most people treat Pio as an all-or-nothing proposition, believing either that every legend is factual or that the discovery of a single fabrication dissolves the entire 50-year record. An evidentiary landscape this uneven requires a formal probabilistic framework to distinguish between legendary accretion and genuine anomaly. We start by categorizing the record into testable datasets: the stigmata, bilocations, healings, soul reading, and posthumous miracles. To evaluate these claims, we will use Bayesian probability. This bar represents our starting condition, known in Bayesian analysis as the prior. It measures 2 competing hypotheses: natural causation on the left and supernatural causation on the right. We treat natural and supernatural causes as exactly equiprobable a priori. We give neither side an initial advantage. To move that slider, the evidence must pass through epistemic filters. These filters determine the statistical weight of the historical records. Filter 1 is documentation quality. Contemporaneous written records generated at the time of the event are weighted far above memoirs written decades later.
Filter 2 is witness orientation. Evidence from a hostile investigator, such as a skeptical medical examiner, carries significant statistical weight if it corroborates a phenomenon. Applying these rigid filters translates messy historical anecdotes into a calculated evaluation of the evidence. When evidence passes through these filters, it pushes our 50-50 baseline in one direction or the other. This updated probability is the posterior. Claims that rely on a single witness or show patterns of legendary accretion generally regress toward the prior. The evidence simply isn't strong enough to move the needle. Take the World War II flying monk incident. Pilgrims claim General Nathan F. Twining saw a monk in the sky over San Giovanni Rotondo, preventing his bombers from dropping their payload. When we process this claim, it fades. General Twining's memoirs never mention it, and official military archives show no mission records over the town. Because the natural explanation, a wartime consolation legend, accounts for the data more cleanly, the probability drops. Conversely, phenomena backed by deep paper trails and high-status corroboration will move the posterior in the other direction. In 1962, a psychiatrist named Wanda Poltavska was diagnosed with a suspected malignant tumor. Bishop Karl Wojtyla wrote to Padre Pio asking for his prayers. 11 days later, Wojtyla wrote a second letter, stating the tumor had disappeared just before surgery. Because we have the surviving physical letters confirming a tight timeline, the statistical needle pushes above the baseline. Using this microscope reveals that Pio's legacy is not one single story, but an uneven landscape of dissolved legends and stubborn, documented anomalies. But the investigation is not about any single isolated incident. We are evaluating the whole picture. To do that, we use the concept of conjunctive improbability.
This matrix shows the individual posterior scores of 11 distinct claims. In a Bayesian model, these independent scores interact and multiply together. This matrix tests the limits of the naturalistic hypothesis. To maintain that every event was purely natural, one must find an independent terrestrial explanation for every anomaly in the set, with no failures in the chain across 50 years. We are testing whether the sheer density of documented anomalies demands a supernatural synthesis. Returning to the physical reality of San Giovanni Rotondo today, we can now view this hospital and shrine complex through a scientific lens. To separate the noise from the signal, we have organized the investigation into 3 arenas. Arena 1 covers the contested lifetime phenomena, the reports of soul reading in the confessional, prophetic statements, and early physical healings. Arena 2 focuses on the medical anomalies of the stigmata. We will analyze the pathology reports and the biological question of maintaining open wounds for 50 years without infection. Arena 3 examines the posthumous healings, the specific cases that survived the scrutiny of the Vatican's medical boards to achieve canonization. As we enter these arenas, our commitment to epistemic neutrality remains absolute. This investigation will process the archival records as they are, whether they suggest genuine medical impossibilities or reveal mythopoeic legend and fraud. Analytical. The framework is set. The baseline is at 0. Over the next 3 episodes, we will examine each claim on its own evidence, then ask what the totality tells us.
In 1887, Francesco Forgione was born in the small farming town of Pietrelcina. Decades before the world knew him as Padre Pio, his early life as a Capuchin friar followed a conventional path. Everything changed on September 20th, 1918. While praying in the friary choir, Francesco reported a sudden, sharp pain. When it passed, his hands, feet, and side were bleeding from deep lacerations. These were the stigmata. What sets this case apart is the timeline. Padre Pio remained at this friary in San Giovanni Rotondo, bleeding from these wounds for exactly 50 years. Evaluating a half-century of bleeding wounds requires setting aside both devotional stories and skeptical assumptions to look at the medical record. We use a Bayesian probability model to analyze the data. We start with a 50-50 prior, assigning equal initial likelihood to a natural medical condition and a supernatural event. Understanding Padre Pio requires treating his 50 years of wounds as an active chronological medical dossier. The 1919 medical reports split the evidence. While the local physician was non-committal, Chief Surgeon Dr. Luigi Romanelli concluded the wounds had no natural cause. Then, pathologist Amico Bignami argued they were maintained artificially using caustic chemicals, specifically iodine. Bignami tested this theory by sealing Padre Pio's hands in tamper-proof bandages for 8 days. If chemicals were being applied in secret, the seal would allow the skin to heal. Instead, the wounds continued to bleed. Despite that result, the Vatican remained wary. Father Agostino Gemelli, a psychologist, labeled Pio a self-mutilating psychopath, though he later admitted he never actually performed a physical examination of the wounds. In 1921, an official apostolic visitor, Bishop Rossi, took a more measured approach. He dismissed several reported miracles, but confirmed that the physical wounds on Pio's hands were real and persistently open. By the early 1920s, the medical consensus was fractured. Skeptics had a theory for fraud, yet no investigator could prove it or force the wounds to close under observation. This stalemate was challenged in 2007, when historian Sergio Luzzatto uncovered new evidence in the Vatican archives.
Luzzatto found a verified 1919 letter from Padre Pio requesting the secret delivery of pure carbolic acid. Carbolic acid is a caustic substance. Applied to skin, it creates severe burns, providing a natural mechanism for the stigmata. However, the request was for only 4 grams, a quantity too small to maintain multiple wounds for any significant time. There is also a historical explanation for the chemical. During the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic, carbolic acid was the standard disinfectant for syringes, and the friars were busy administering injections to local students.
Medical examiners also noted a discrepancy in the pathology. Phenol burns produced distinct, sharply inflamed edges and white necrotic tissue. But multiple doctors reported that Pio's wounds were perfectly clean and lacked any signs of chemical inflammation. The archival discovery confirms the 1919 request for chemicals, but the biological reality of those wounds doesn't align with the known effects of a caustic burn. A naturalistic explanation suggests that a psychosomatic trigger in 1918 was maintained for decades by the secret use of iodine or phenol. But that theory fails to account for 2 significant facts. Pio lived for 50 years with open wounds in a pre-antibiotic era without a single infection, and he avoided detection while under constant scrutiny from hostile observers. There is also the odor of sanctity. Hostile investigators and skeptics alike repeatedly reported a floral perfume coming from the wounds, a phenomenon that simple chemistry or metabolism struggles to explain. The final anomaly appeared at Padre Pio's death in 1968. If wounds are kept open for 50 years using chemicals or physical irritation, they leave permanent, heavy scarring. Yet the friars who prepared his body reported that the skin where the stigmata had been was perfectly smooth and completely unblemished. When we calculate the final probability, balancing the credible evidence of chemical requests against the extreme statistical improbability of surviving 50 years of open wounds without infection or scarring, the model settles at 58%. This score reflects a case where the physical evidence just manages to outweigh the historical red flags. The stigmata of Padre Pio remains a documented medical mystery. It is a case where the biological anomalies continue to linger, even when faced with the evidence of human frailty. Francesco Forgione, better known as Padre Pio, sits at the center of thousands of contested historical anomalies. He is a historical focal point where medical mysteries and intense devotion intersect. The problem with evaluating these claims is how they are typically treated. Devotional writers often accept a half-century of folklore without question. On the other side, skeptics frequently dismiss surviving, documented medical anomalies out of hand. Neither approach is historically rigorous. To get a clearer picture, we need a strict framework. We are going to evaluate 8 lifetime claims attributed to Pio, and every single one starts here, at an absolute neutral baseline, where a natural explanation and a supernatural one are equally probable. From this 50% mark, crowd size and popular belief do not matter. The needle will only move based on the epistemic weight of the evidence, things like physical paper trails, hostile witness testimony, and biological base rates. Strip away 50 years of folklore, apply a rigorous filter, and let the verifiable evidence dictate the final probability. Curious. We begin with File 1, the Wanda Poltowska healing. In November 1962, a 41-year-old mother of 4 was diagnosed with an intestinal mass, presumed to be malignant. 11 days later, just before her scheduled surgery, the tumor vanished. This case left behind the most substantial paper trail of Pio's life, 2 surviving Latin letters, written by the man who requested the intercession, Bishop Karl Wojtyla, the future Pope John Paul II. But apply the skeptical filter. The primary diagnosis was presumptive. No tissue biopsy was ever performed to confirm malignancy. Poltowska herself, a trained psychiatrist, told her doctors there was a 5% chance the initial diagnosis was simply mistaken. The verdict for File 1. The documentation pushes the needle up, but the lack of a confirming biopsy acts as a hard cap. The posterior settles at 62%. Compare that to File 2, the Damiani bilocation. In 1941, an archbishop in Uruguay was awakened in the night by a Capuchin friar, instructing him to attend to a dying colleague. The archbishop is a high-status witness,
but the story was not publicized until 8 years after the event. Combine that massive delay with the known perceptual biases of a half-awakened state in a dark hallway, and the credibility drops rapidly. The verdict for File 2? A single human memory cannot overcome those structural flaws. The needle falls to 40%. The disparity in these scores comes down to documentation. The presence of a verifiable record shifts the probability in a way that singular testimony cannot. This dynamic becomes vital when we look at the environment surrounding Pio. The massive Casa Salievo della Sofferenza Hospital in San Giovanni Rotondo, set against the backdrop of the Second World War, created the perfect breeding ground for rumors. Consider File 3, the flying monk. Allied pilots allegedly saw a figure in the sky, causing their bombs to fail and halting air raids. The story claims this led USAAF General Nathan Twining to convert to Catholicism. We can verify this. Twining wrote a detailed memoir. The military kept extensive, declassified mission reports. Across all those archives, there is zero record of a mission over the town, no mention of a monk, and no Catholic conversion. The verdict for File 3. The claim collapses entirely into wartime legend, 15%. We see a similar problem with medical claims.
File 4 examines Gemma Di Giorgi, who reportedly saw perfectly despite a severe structural eye defect. File 7 looks at Giovanni Savino, a construction worker whose sight was restored after his right eye was destroyed by dynamite. Both cases feature striking visual outcomes and a long list of surviving witnesses, yet both lack the ultimate proof. There are no modern, peer-reviewed ophthalmological case reports or primary hospital charts available to verify the exact pathology. The verdicts. The outcomes are highly unusual, but without clinical data, the scores are capped. Gemma lands at 45%, Savino at 55%. The fog of war applies to messy, undocumented hospital wards just as much as military campaigns. Without clinical data, even the most miraculous-looking recoveries cannot escape the natural margin of error. Now we open File 5, Reading Souls. Across 5 decades, penitents consistently claimed Pio possessed extraordinary knowledge of their undisclosed sins in the confessional. The volume of witnesses is enormous, but the phenomenon is structurally unfalsifiable. In an environment of tens of thousands of confessions a year, the statistical hits, lucky guesses, cold reading, recognizing common patterns, are heavily evangelized. The misses are simply forgotten. The verdict. The sheer volume cannot overcome the inherent bias structures of the reporting. The needle stays exactly where it started, 50%. We find a similar pattern in File 6, the odor of sanctity. Hostile, skeptical investigators swore they smelled a distinct floral scent emanating from Pio, but Pio fasted heavily, which produces sweet-smelling ketosis, and he admitted to chronic use of iodine, which has a sharp chemical odor. That combination creates a highly plausible natural composite. The verdict for File 6, highly attested but naturally replicable, 60%. File 8 examines prophetic statements. Pio supposedly predicted the 1963 election of Pope Paul VI and specifically told Carol Wojtyla he would ascend to the papacy. There is a fatal flaw in this claim. Pope John Paul II repeatedly and explicitly denied ever receiving that prophecy, making the entire story a classic case of retrospective attribution. The verdict for File 8? Devastated by the primary subject's own denial, 20%. Phenomena tied to human psychology, visions, sense, and selective memories are uniquely vulnerable. The devout human mind naturally desires to find profound patterns even where none exist. This chart shows all 8 of our case files aligned by their final probability scores. As you can see, the evidentiary landscape around Padre Pio is exceptionally uneven, ranging from a 15% debunked legend to a 62% documented medical anomaly. Run through a neutral Bayesian stress test, the vast majority of famous Padre Pio narratives dissolve into cognitive bias, suggestion, and folklore. Yet this rigorous scrubbing performs a vital function. It isolates a genuine signal. The handful of cases anchored in physical documents and hostile attestation survive the scrutiny. They remain stubbornly, genuinely anomalous. In the investigation of the supernatural, the size of a devoted crowd is a terrible proxy for the truth. The most compelling evidence never relies on the volume of the believers. It is always found in the quiet, surviving paper trails.
Padre Pio is surrounded by a dense fog of supernatural claims, but when subjected to rigorous historical scrutiny, many of the most famous stories, like reports of him flying over World War II battlefields or reading souls on demand, evaporate into single-witness folklore, and the Catholic Church itself agrees. When it came time to officially recognize him as a saint, Rome made a deliberate choice to bypass his famous stigmata and lifetime marvels entirely. To build the foundation of his modern legacy, the Curia demanded strict medical data. They required cases of posthumous healing that survived exhaustive clinical review. This graphic represents our analytical starting point, a perfectly balanced 50-50 split between a natural explanation and supernatural intercession. By applying this rigid, mathematically neutral framework to the two medical cases the Vatican actually used, we can remove devotional bias and see if Rome's decision holds up to the numbers. The first test case is from November 1995. A 46-year-old woman named Consilia de Martino arrived at the hospital with a massive, rapidly expanding fluid mass in her neck. CT scans confirmed a ruptured thoracic duct, leaking an estimated 2 liters of lymphatic fluid. Surgery was scheduled immediately, but the next morning, without any medication, drainage, or operative intervention, the mass had entirely vanished. To weight the evidence naturally, we have to look at the clinical baseline. Medical literature shows that up to 50% of traumatic chyle leaks resolve spontaneously under conservative management. The Vatican's own medical consultation board acknowledged the space rate. They officially classified the event as a miraculum quod modum, explicitly noting that the recovery itself was biologically possible. The true anomaly was the overnight speed without any treatment. Our diagram returns to weigh these factors. The imaging confirmed rapid resolution pulls the needle upward, but the high natural vase rate holds it back. The probability for this specific case locks in at 65% supernatural. A 65% outcome is undeniably unusual, but on its own, it leaves too much room for a natural, physiological anomaly to prove definitive intercession. The second case moves to January 2000. 7-year-old Matteo Colella contracted fulminant meningococcal meningitis. He quickly progressed into a deep coma with septic shock, and his major organ systems began failing. As his condition deteriorated, his mother held a vigil right down the street and prayed the rosary at Padre Pio's tomb. Days later, Matteo woke up. He spontaneously reported a vision of an old man with a white beard pulling him to his feet, and later identified the figure from a photograph. Following his awakening, the boy made a rapid recovery with 0 neurological or physical impairments. But severe attribution problems exist. Matteo was treated in a highly resourced modern pediatric ICU. With aggressive management, like plasma exchange, survival for previously healthy children with this exact condition can reach 91%. There is also a thick layer of institutional entanglement here. The hospital treating him was founded by Padre Pio. The boy's father was a staff physician there, and the family was deeply devoted to the friar, ensuring total cultural saturation for the boy's vision. Looking at the scale for Matteo's case, the complete absence of physical damage after a severe coma pushes the probability up. However, the aggressive concurrent ICU care caps the final posterior at 60%. Just like the first case, when viewed in isolation, a 60% probability reflects a remarkable medical outcome, but the high success rate of modern intensive care leaves a wide path for a strictly natural recovery. If we stop here, analyzing claims one by one, the case for Padre Pio feels stalled in the mid-60s. But the true evidentiary picture requires looking at the aggregate reality of all 11 claims investigated in our full report. To evaluate this mathematically, we use a rule called conjunctive improbability. We want to find the exact statistical chance that every single one of these anomalies has a perfectly natural explanation. This table lists all 11 events. By multiplying the probability of a natural cause for the first case by the second and continuing straight down the list, the compounding math reveals a final natural probability of just 0.045%, which means the inverse mathematical truth, the probability that at least one of these claims is a genuine supernatural event, soars to 99.95%. Even if we strip away the weaker folklore and restrict the math to only the 3 highest quality, best documented cases, the cumulative probability still holds firmly at 94.7%. And if we strictly isolate the data to just the 2 Vatican-certified posthumous healings, the probability of at least one genuine supernatural event remains a robust 86%. Modest, independent probabilities do not cancel each other out, they multiply. Across varying medical conditions, different decades, and completely distinct sets of witnesses, the conjunctive improbability accumulates so rapidly that it shifts the statistical burden of proof squarely onto the skeptic. The goal of Bayesian analysis is never absolute, infallible certainty. It is about calibrating the weight of the available evidence. What the math ultimately reveals is that the Vatican's institutional caution was correct. They actively discarded the noisy folklore and built their case entirely on the isolated medical anomalies. That rigorous, decades-long filtering process culminated in June 2002 with his formal canonization in St. Peter's Square. Pope John Paul II, who had personally navigated this evidence for decades, issued the final decree before one of the largest crowds in Roman history. In the end, Rome canonized Padre Pio on the strength of his posthumous medical anomalies, passing over the stigmata and the lifetime marvels entirely. That specific, deliberate choice remains the wisest, most scientifically sound summary of where the evidence actually points.
Over the last 4 episodes, we've subjected the life of Francesco Forgione to a rigorous forensic and historical autopsy. This diagram maps the 11 major supernatural claims surrounding him. By multiplying the probability matrices for these events, the mathematical verdict lands at a cumulative probability of 99.95% that at least one genuine supernatural event occurred. A medical dossier and a set of Bayesian posteriors can successfully identify a statistical anomaly. They cannot capture a human soul. To understand Padre Pio, we have to close the casebook and confront the man behind the statistics. Scientific evidence brings us to the threshold of belief. Crossing that threshold requires looking at the agonizing cross he actually carried. For decades, Pio's daily routine involved sitting inside a wooden confessional, like the one shown here, for up to 19 hours a day, absorbing the failures and griefs of thousands of pilgrims. His daily Mass stretched for 2 to 3 hours. During the consecration, he visibly suffered, his hands trembling as he elevated the host. His private correspondence with his spiritual directors reveals the psychological toll of this existence. For decades, he operated in a profound, dark night of the soul, feeling entirely abandoned by God. While the public sensationalized his bleeding wounds, Pio's own letters describe the stigmata as a source of intense humiliation and utter confusion. This grueling, hidden reality formed the vertical beam of his cruciform life. His excruciating private relationship with God forged the spiritual endurance required for his public miracles. How does a human being survive 50 years of relentless physical pain and profound spiritual desolation without breaking? The first pillar of his survival was his absolute reliance on the Eucharist and the Mass. He often stated that the earth could exist more easily without the sun than without the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The second pillar was his lifelong devotion to the Blessed Mother. Pio's ministry unfolded during the 20th century, an era heavily defined by major Marian apparitions from Lourdes to Fatima. He prayed multiple rosaries every single day, explicitly instructing followers to treat the beads as a literal weapon against the evils of the modern world. Together, the Mass and the Rosary acted as an endless source of spiritual fuel. They prevented his interior suffering from entirely consuming him. That intense, private grace didn't remain trapped in a cloister. It naturally flowed outward into concrete, physical charity for the rest of the world. In 1956, he spearheaded the founding of the Home for the Relief of Suffering, transforming a barren Italian mountainside into the massive premier research hospital you see here. This is the exact facility where 7-year-old Matteo Colella experienced his medically inexplicable healing from total multi-organ failure. Pio believed that human suffering is never meaningless. When united to Christ, he taught, pain becomes a tangible, redemptive force for others. The hospital stands as brick-and-mortar proof
that his vertical connection to heaven always manifested horizontally in radical love for humanity. Despite rarely leaving his rural monastery, this humble friar ended up counseling international leaders, bishops, and future popes, like Karol Wojtyla, pictured here. His influence expanded rapidly at the grassroots level, as local prayer groups dedicated to his spirituality multiplied into the thousands worldwide. On September 22, 1968, he passed away. It was exactly 50 years and 2 days after the stigmata had first appeared on his body. This precise chronological closure, paired with a massive, enduring global legacy, severely strains any cynical explanation of a localized, lifelong fraud. This brings us to a conclusion firmly rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition of Thomas Aquinas and Pope Benedict XVI. Rigorous reason and authentic faith are never enemies. Statistical calculations do not generate faith, but they do successfully dismantle the modern prejudice that all supernatural claims are inherently irrational. Science proves his medical anomalies were real, but the millions of people who knew him prove his profound holiness. When you strip away the forensic analysis, the probability matrices, and the academic tone, you are left with the simple, pastoral heart of a priest. He left us with a final directive: pray, hope, and don't worry. Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, pray for us.